And there's also steps here. There's 2 parts to sweat soldering, okay? So part 1 is sweating the solder to the bigger piece of metal, which in most instances is probably the bottom piece. I also like to do the bottom piece because this creates a heat sink, and so it takes more energy and more heat to heat this piece up. In order for metal to flow to 2 sides of metal the same, this piece of metal and this piece of metal need to be the same temperature, okay? So if the piece is bigger, you have to spend more time on that side, okay? And remember, when you're soldering, it's the heat of the metal that melts the solder, not the torch, okay? So you wanna avoid putting the torch on the solder because the solder will get dirty and it won't melt, okay? So really pay attention to where the torch is when I'm doing this. And the other part is learning about how many pieces of solder do I need? And I usually think of the piece that I want to float, or the area of space, I think of it as being like a dice. So if I look at this piece of metal, I'm probably gonna put 8 pieces of metal, or I'm sorry, 8 pieces of solder in order for it to flow out to the seams, because we think of this like a PB and J, okay? We wanna squeeze it and have the peanut butter, which is the solder, come all the way out to the edge, and you should see a silver lining around the entire piece, okay? So in order for me to know where I need to do that, is I like to use a scribe, and I like to scribe around the square so that I know where to put my flux and my solder. Does everybody remember why we use flux? It's the white stuff. Anybody know what the flux does?
Keep the metal clean.
Yeah, good job. It keeps that metal clean, and that has ochre all through it. Keeps the metal clean. If you don't use this, your solder will never melt. Never melt. Okay, so I'm gonna put this on there like a glazed donut, okay? If you have too much on there, sometimes it inhibits from flowing well, so I like to think of it like a glazed donut. All right, put this aside, and now I'm gonna scoop up my solder that I already have cut into little chips. Now, depending on your solder size, that also is gonna determine how many pieces. I usually say 1/3 of a sprinkle, right? So I'm gonna put some, this is like the hardest part, is finding a pair of these that work. When you guys are learning how to solder, remember these little pieces, these little tweezers are only used for this. If you start putting them inside the torch and using them like a solder pick, you'll damage all of these and you'll be really frustrated when you go to solder because you won't be able to pick it up, okay? So I got 1, 2, 3 pieces, 4 pieces, and then 2 pieces on this side. So I need 2 more pieces, okay? Is everybody with me so far? And they're different sizes. I actually borrowed a student's solder, so, you know, this is kind of like how you guys would be cutting solder. And I'm using hard solder. You can either use hard or medium. I can't get this out. Oh, good. Can't get the last piece out. So we're gonna go over these little things. Okay, so I'm gonna move this solder where I need it to go in just a minute because the flux is actually starting to dry. And the reason for that is because Esme was using it, so this soldering brick is already hot. I like to put this on top of 2 pieces of wire, steel wire, to allow the heat to kind of go underneath and there's not as much of a heat sink. I have my torch kind of on low and I'm just going in a circle nice and slow. I'm avoiding the solder. And once that flux is clear, that's when I can move the solder to where I need it to go. So right now it's almost clear, still a little bit white. You'll see it go past heat patina temp. And now I'm just gonna take a moment and move my solder. I can see my scribe line that I made, and I'm gonna make sure my solder is inside that scribe line. I'm kind of spacing my solder out strategically, and I'm gonna go like this. Now, when this solder starts to sweat, I want it to be like chocolate chip cookies where it just kind of starts to melt a little bit. So this metal is probably hot enough now, and it's gonna start to sweat now. So I'm just kind of moving my torch over the solder, okay? That sweated a little bit more than I would have liked, but I'm kind of talking and doing it at the same time. Okay, so here, I'm gonna quench it. Now, on a perfect day, when I'm not doing a demo, this is pretty clean, but can you see right here, it got a little dirty. That solder's not gonna flow there probably. So I would wanna quench that, put it in the pickle, bring it back out in a couple minutes, and do it when it's nice and clean, okay? I'm just gonna do it all at once because you guys will get the point, and I don't want you guys to come back up here. So now I'm gonna set it back down, this is part 2. You apply flux now to both pieces of bread, aka metal. So I'm gonna put more flux on here. The reason I'm adding more flux to the piece that I already added flux to, anybody know? Why would I put more flux on there? Do you think there's still flux on there after heating it up all that much? No, I burnt that all. That's gone. So now there's flux here, sandwich, little sandwich, okay? And now I'm gonna heat it up. That bottom piece of metal is bigger. I'm gonna put more heat on the bottom piece. While I'm heating up the bottom piece, that top piece is gonna wiggle. It's gonna wiggle from the flux. And it's gonna start getting hot just because it's sitting on top of the big piece of metal, okay? So once the flux is clear, I'll slide it over a little bit, but I'm really only putting my torch on the edges. Hottest part of the tip is just beyond that blue. I can slide it, just give it a little slide. I'd like to make sure I have a bigger pair of tweezers so that if it starts to move a little bit, I can kind of push it, and then I push on it a little bit sometimes if I don't see it go all the way down, but you should see it kind of drop. Add a little bit of pressure on there. And I want to make sure it comes all the way through the sides. Whoops, I just knocked it all out, but I think we're good. So that's hot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. When it's not bright red and it's kind of going black again, you can quench this. My torch went out on its own, but I bumped it. But what you're looking for, this is too dirty now, but you're looking for, after you take it out of the pickle, you're looking for a little tiny spot of silver glow, like a halo, okay? So do that as a sample. Thank you very much.